Okay, so I want to dive into the topic of guilt today. And mainly because I see so many of my clients struggle with their relationship with guilt, and me included. I did for years, and I'm sure it still affects me. Do you know what I mean? But I'm much more aware of it now. But what's really fascinating is guilt is one of these emotions or feelings that really dictates our behavior in life, and just the same as anything else is fear. Fear can hold us back. When we're excited, that usually propels us to move forward. So obviously, like, emotions and feelings are a big part of being human. And like, even just I was just listening to a podcast that Tony Robbins was on, and he was talking about information without emotion doesn't leave an impact. But when you take in our information and there's an emotion attached with it, that's when your nervous system gets imprinted on. That's when you remember things and you can recall things much easier. But guilt is one of those emotions I see so many ambitious people deal with. And it's wild because, you know, I made a post the other day about guilt and like kind of three hidden truths that you don't realize that are associated with guilt. I'm going to go through those as we kind of go through this episode here. But one of those points is the fact that guilt is an emotion or a feeling just like anything else is. And it's fleeting, right? It's a fleeting thing. It can come and it can go, but most of us look at guilt as almost like this badge of honor. You know, like when we're feeling guilty, we usually just, chop it up to the fact that we're really empathetic or we consider people's feelings. And of course, there's merit to that. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, I just want to be the best. I don't want to disappoint my parents by not showing up. I want to be the best wife, or I want to be the best parent, or the best colleague, or leader, whatever the case is. And so, when we want to move towards decisions that we think are going to support said roles, it's usually the guilt of not showing up for those other parties that often dictates our behavior. Okay. But what guilt also does a lot of the time is it takes us away from ourselves, you know? And I see so many of my clients dealing with this, so many high performers where, most of their careers, their relationships, everything have kind of been built around this idea of guilt. Now, the thing with guilt is when we let it dictate our behavior that much, well, eventually what it does is it leads us further away from us because we never feel guilty about ourselves. You know what I mean? Like we always feel guilt in relation to other people. Like I can't guilt me into like not doing something for me. Like it just doesn't work that way. We feel guilt because again, we can't show up for others the way in which we feel like we have to or need to, or maybe that they're even projecting onto us. But then again, what happens is when we're constantly living for things outside of us, that leads to resentment, that leads to disconnect, that leads to burnout, which ultimately leads to not living a fulfilling life and not living a life that feels, purposeful and in alignment. So guilt is one of those emotions that I think it's really important to address because again, most of us have been kind of wearing it with this martyr type identity attached to it when really we have to look at the relationship we have with it in itself. And, I'll just reflect on my own relationship with guilt. When I started to realize, first of all, that there was even such thing with a relationship with guilt, because you can have one, by the way, and I'll dive into that a little further, is when my dad was still alive. He passed in May of last year. And he had lived in long-term care, in a long-term care facility for the past, I think about 5 years. And so, if you've ever had a parent or a family member live in there, it's honestly quite sad. It was the best place for him to be because we didn't have the capacity to look after him at home anymore. My mom had done a lot for him, but she's also getting older, and he was getting more sick, and like he needed to be in a place with professional help, just as far as physically. But living in a long-term care facility is he was the youngest person in there, so everyone's deteriorating at a really fast rate. He's watching TV all day and watching the news and consuming the news. Like, obviously, we know how unhealthy that is. The food they're serving him, my mom was wonderful and did a lot of cooking for him from home still, but he's still consuming a lot of the cafeteria food, which we all know is shit, right? In the healthcare system. And so, it's not the most uplifting place to be, and I remember it was like when he had first went in there in the first couple of years, and my parents lived 2 hours away from me. So, it's a little bit of a drive to go see them. And I went through this phase where I was still working at my old career. So I was working, you know, 50 hours a week. I was burnt out, I was exhausted, and my dad's now living in this long-term care facility. And there was a lot of guilt associated with the fact that he was no longer at home, but we knew it was the right decision for him to be there. Um, but all of a sudden, one day, I just felt this massive wave of guilt, and I felt like I had to be there every weekend with him. And so I was constantly calling my mom, "Hey, I'm going to come home this day. I'm going to come home that day, da 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 da." And I was just going any free time I had. I felt like I needed to go see him. And I was exhausted already. Okay. So now adding a 2 hour trip, well, 4 hours there and back to my already crazy hectic schedule when I'm running on like a depleted state energetically, it was tough. And I remember one day my mom calling me and she's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Well, what are you trying to do right now? Like, I just want to understand." And I told her, I said, "Mom, I just feel like I don't know how long we have left with dad. And I feel like I need to do everything I can to spend as much time with him now because I have so much guilt around the fact that he's, essentially stuck in there and the rest of us get to keep moving on with our lives." And I cried as I was telling her this. And, she said, she's like, "I understand why you feel that way. And, we love you for it." She's like, "But you have to keep living your life." She's like, "Don't worry about your dad." She's like, "I might die before your dad." She used to always say that. She's like, "Your dad might outlive me." Um, but she was like, "You have to keep living your life. We know you love us. We know you love him. He knows you love him. Like, and you come down here when you can." She's like, "But you don't need to be like breaking your back to make this happen purely out of that." And I really appreciated her saying that. And that's one thing my parents have always been really good at, is like never wanting their kids to sacrifice their life for anything for them. And like, I don't know, especially if immigrant parents, like that's a common trend in a lot of those households is they want their kids to live life for them the way they see fit. And I've been really blessed that like my parents don't operate that way. They were never wired that way. They always wanted us to do the most we can in life, be good kids, be good people, work hard. But they never wanted to hold us back based on what they needed. And so when she said that, it relieved so much pressure off of me. And for the first time, I sat back and I really looked at that relationship and I was like, so why do I feel like I needed to do that? Like, where was that coming from? And the guilt started to come up and it was like, and then I was realizing that it was like, it wasn't even the relationship with my dad that needed improvement. It was my relationship with guilt. Like I had, I would say almost like an addiction or a wiring to the feeling of guilt. And so whenever I felt guilt, it made me feel like I was alive. It made me feel like I was doing something, which is really wild. Okay. So let's dive into that a little bit more because one of the things I did talk about in that post that I mentioned is the fact that you can have an unhealthy relationship with guilt. And where that stems from, the reason, if you're trying to figure out if you have that or not, you probably grew up in a household where you had to do something in order for a certain outcome. So, like, if you didn't do this, you wouldn't receive love or connection. And if you did something wrong, you're kind of guilted into the fact that you did that. That may show up in the way that you people please now. It can be a few different things. But, when some of us have grown up in households where, if you didn't uphold a certain standard based on your caregiver or your surroundings, you were almost like condemned or shamed for it. And that could be something as simple as like your parents just saying they're disappointed in you. That could be something as maybe a parent kind of withholding connection from you. Like that can show up in different ways. And we have to remember that when we're kids, like when we talk about these experiences as children, um, they say like up till the age of like 12, you don't have the ability to have like proper discernment towards what an actual situation is. So something like, my parents both worked a ton to take care of me and my brothers. And so they were out of the house all day. And, you know, while they were doing it to put food on the table and to take care of us because they loved us, as a kid, I have now processed as I'm older the fact that they were gone all the time, that I equated it as the fact that they just didn't want to be at home with me. And that's not the truth, obviously, but this is the brain of a child. The child can't understand what the bigger picture is. They just say, well, my parents aren't home, so they must not want to spend time with me. And that can go further to then thinking like, oh, well, then did I do something wrong? Like, why don't they want to be here? I want to be with them all day. Why aren't they with me all day? Again, can't conceptualize that there's bills and a mortgage to be paid, right? So if we go back to that relationship with guilt, if we look at how we grew up and kind of the dynamics that were at play, and again, to no one's fault, it's not like our parents or our caregivers were trying to make us feel guilty. It's just the natural association of things. When we grew up in situations where we constantly felt that guilt, what that means is our nervous system equated that to being like, well, if we feel guilty, we're alive and we're doing something right. Okay, that's the early association we make as children. That's the imprint that guilt leaves on our nervous system. So then subconsciously, as we get older, what happens is because we attach guilt with survival, and again, that's the point of the nervous system. It's not to make you happy or to hope you're thriving or growing. The point of the nervous system is just to keep you alive. As we get older and the nervous system is constantly looking for things to verify that it's alive, it will naturally gravitate towards situations where you can feel the guilt. Okay. And that's how your relationship with guilt is formed. So, I was listening to this interview on Diary of a CEO, and I think he was talking to Joe Dispenza, the host, and he was talking about how he he was going through this period where he'd like every night at like midnight, he'd sneak down to have cookies. Okay. And he's like, and I can't stop. Every night I go down, I have a cookie. He's like, I know I shouldn't be eating cookies at midnight. He's like, and then as soon as I do, I feel guilty about why I did that. He's like, so how can I break that pattern? And I'm pretty sure it was Dr. Joe Dispenza. I could be wrong. So if I'm misquoting, just sorry. But he goes, well, it's not the habit of the cookie we need to break. What we need to look at is your relationship with guilt. Because if you have a addictive relationship with guilt where you need that to feel like you're alive, then you're going to constantly be putting yourself in situations where you can relive that feeling because it tells you you're alive. Okay. And so again, if I transfer that same concept to what I gave you about my relationship with going to see my dad in the hospital, I think that was it. I think to me, feeling guilty made me feel like I was a good daughter, and my parents didn't think that. You know what I mean? Like my parents were like, oh, because you feel guilty, now we can verify your love. Like, no, my parents already knew I loved them, right? Like they were, that was shown in so many different ways. And obviously they love me. So, like they would never even hold me to that standard. But in my head, I thought, well, the guilt makes me a better daughter. And that's nowhere even near their psyche. So then it just goes to show that I was putting myself through this suffering and this internal conflict and ultimately taking myself away from what I truly needed in the moment, because the reality is as much as I would have loved to spend more time with my dad, at that time in my life, I needed more rest. I needed to spend more time connecting with myself because I was so burnt out. I needed to take care of myself in a way where I could show up as the best version of me. And for me at that time, that required more rest, more recovery, and just spending a lot of time in stillness so I could get to the bottom of it. And what that would have done is if I would have taken the time to do those things, which I eventually did, the times then when I was with my parents or my dad, I would have been able to be more present. But if I was rushing home every weekend because I felt like the hours there made it better, but I wasn't actually present with him because, again, I was so burnt out, like what would have been the quality of that time, anyways? I would have never actually been in the moment with him. I would have been ruminating on the past, worrying about the future, because that's what happens when you're dysregulated and burnt out. Okay. So the quality of our connection wouldn't have been great, anyways. But again, it was that situation that really made me start to realize that everyone has their own relationship with guilt. And whatever situations are bringing the most guilt out of you, I encourage you to actually look at not the situation itself, but your relationship. Okay. Now, the other thing we need to point on with that is that guilt is an emotion of the moment, right? It doesn't mean it's the reality of the situation. And I think that's where we get confused is when we feel that guilt because we've been used to feeling it for so long. When the guilt comes up in your body, we naturally start to attach a story with it. Okay. And the story is something about the fact that in order for us to be a good wife, husband, friend, daughter, CEO, whatever, in order for us to be a good insert title here, we need to show up a certain way. And then that's where the story comes into play. And all of a sudden, we think it's this big reality that we're creating. Again, I thought in order for me to be a good daughter, I had to do this when that wasn't the fact of the situation. Guilt was just a feeling of the moment that I was experiencing. Okay. But because it was so strong and because I've been used to feeling it for so long, it felt so real. But then what happens is because we think in our head it is the truth of the situation, then what we start to do is it starts to affect our behavior. Okay. And that's what we don't want to happen. Okay. We don't want our behavior to start being dictated by something that's not the truth. Like I think we've all heard the saying, like, your feelings are valid, but they're not necessarily real, right? Like your feelings aren't facts. They are an experience of the moment, just like guilt is. Guilt is an experience of the moment. And the chances are the reason you feel guilt more often and you experience it more often is because you are pretty empathetic, highly empathetic, probably. And again, maybe you grew up in a household where there's an aspect of conditional love and maybe not intentionally. You know what I mean? Like I always like to point out when we're talking about like how you grew up, it's not because your parents were trying to do this to you. You know what I mean? Like they did the best they can. And even as now that we're adults, we can see like, oh, they did do a great job, right? But again, we have to understand that the brain of a child and the child does not conceptualize things the way we do as adults. Okay. So, when we're talking about, guilt being in the moment, we need to make sure that we're not making decisions from something that's just a fleeting feeling. And that's with anything. That's with fear. That's with feeling really ecstatic. Like, the best place you can make decisions from is when you're even keel, right? You can see the highs for what they are. You can see the lows for what they are. And you can exist somewhere in the middle and make the best decision for you, right? But when we're allowing emotions to dictate our behavior, well, then again, that's when we end up in that rut of resentment and disconnected within because we're allowing something that's fleeting to make decisions for us, right? And, the other thing about that is sometimes guilt can actually get projected on us from other people. And they often call that emotional contamination, which means that other people are projecting their feelings of guilt onto us. And we might not even feel like originally it's a situation we need to feel guilty about. But because the other person is feeling some type of way about said situation, we absorb it from them. Okay. And so I use this example I have with a client. And essentially, she had this opportunity to go on a trip. And this trip, she really wanted to go. She found great flights. It was a great opportunity for her and her husband to kind of get away for a little bit. She had to clear it with a couple people to make sure it was fine, and it was. But if she went on this trip, she was going to miss a really important event with her sibling. And she knew that if she chose to go on this trip, it would trigger some wounds from childhood about leaving said sibling on this trip. And she felt a lot of guilt about it. And when we first started talking about it, she's like, I already looked at flights last night. The flights are cheap. The days work out. Everyone's working. I just need to talk to my sibling about this. And she's like, and I know right away this is going to be an issue. I know they're going to say this. I know da 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 da. She gave me all the things. And I stopped her and I said, you're already creating the situation and you haven't even had a conversation yet. Like, you're already writing the story and you have no idea what she's actually going to say. Like, is it an educated guess? Yeah, of course it is, because she knows her dynamic. But like, the fact that she created this entire story and all the outcomes before the conversation was even had is something we all naturally do, right? Again, that is survival, because we as humans like certainty. And so we feel like if we can like generate situations of certainty, of we know what the potential outcomes are going to be, that somehow that's going to be better for us. You know what I mean? When what that's actually doing is the subconscious is taking evidence of the past and using that to reinforce what's potentially going to happen in the future. Okay. We think it's better for us because we think it's not real. It's fictitious, but we're executing some type of control by doing this. But all we're doing is perpetuating disappointing situations of the past onto the future because that's what we know. Okay. So she went into this big scenario and I had to stop her. I said, look, I said, you're already going to this place of projecting guilt onto the situation because you think this is going to play out just like it has in the past, right? And whether it does or doesn't isn't the point here. The point here is that we can project guilt, even if guilt isn't actually present. Again, my parents were not guilting me into coming, but I felt the guilt. I projected the guilt, right? And we have to be really careful of that, because why would we want to take on that emotion or that experience if we don't have to? Well, it goes back to the relationship, because that's what makes you feel safe and alive, right? But here's the thing about guilt is there's a fine line between guilt and shame. And in my experience, guilt can actually be productive in some ways, because you can kind of learn from the situations where you feel that. Like, you can experience the guilt, and if it kind of stops there, you can be like, okay, so this is what I learned about the situation. I do feel guilty for what played out, but I'm going to learn from it. Where I find it turns into a slippery slope is where guilt starts to turn into shame. So it goes from, oh, I just, I want to be the best daughter that I can by showing up. You know what I mean? So it can be coming from that place, but then it can easily turn into, yeah, but you're not, because you didn't do this and you didn't do that. And how dare you want to stay at home and rest instead of go seeing your dad who's stuck in the hospital? And how could you do this? And why would you respond? And then the shame train starts. And that is a slippery slope, my friends. Okay. And so then now it goes from guilt of just being a compassionate, kind person to now shaming and berating yourself, which we all know is so unproductive. It's so unproductive, guys, to shame yourself. And so many of us have stayed in that space for so long. And to be honest, I feel like most high performers do that. Most high performers are really good at shaming themselves. And that's not a badge of honor to wear. Now, what the shame often does is it motivates them to do more. But then what you end up in the cycle of is, if shame is your motivator to keep going, eventually when you accomplish said thing and you typically are going after it, so you kind of cure the shame, that doesn't actually happen. Because when you arrive, it's not coming from a place of wanting fulfillment or trying to do something in alignment with you. So then when you arrive at said place, because it was coming from a fear place or a judgment place, there's actually no fulfillment attached to it. And then you keep chasing and chasing and chasing. And there's no like checkpoint there. Like maybe 30 minutes, but then you end up on this slippery slope. And that's why there's a lot of people who have all the things you could ever imagine, materially, financially, and they're still depressed and they're still not fulfilled and they still feel alone all the time. Right? That's a slippery slope between shame and guilt. And so When we're feeling this is why it's really important to take a step back and actually, like, you know, really process and take space for what's happening in the moment. Like, what is fact? Not what do I feel? What is fact? And then you have to look at your relationship with guilt. And it's like, well, how often am I feeling guilt? Is this a daily thing? Is this a weekly thing? Right? We got to ask some tough questions around that. And then what you need to do is once you okay, let me back up. This is what we want to do when it comes to working on our relationship with guilt. Okay, I'm going to break this down a little bit more for you guys so it's a little bit more practical. Okay, so that was kind of the concept around what the guilt is. Now I'm going to give you some practical steps, okay, to help shape that relationship and to help you feel guilt less often. So the first thing I would say is we need to identify and separate guilt from shame. So just like I said, guilt can often get confused with shame, whereas, guilt tends to be a specific action, like I made a mistake. Shame feels like an attack on yourself. So I'm a bad person. So, in hopes of rewiring the relationship with guilt, we need to identify the difference. So, again, guilt can be helpful, shame often keeps you stuck. So, an action step you can do to help you with this is when you feel guilty, ask yourself, is this guilt about something I did, or am I making it about who I am as a person? This shift in perspective lets you see that guilt is often a natural reaction to specific actions and not a reflection of your overall character. So, again, we're not personalizing it. Okay. It's an experience of the moment. We don't need to make it any deeper than what it is. But again, it's about halting yourself, taking a moment back, becoming aware of the situation, and then asking yourself that tough questions. Now, the second thing we want to do is we want to switch up some of these guilt inducing beliefs. So we need to look at what our core beliefs around guilt are. So sometimes they can come from our family, they can come from our cultures. But a lot of these, beliefs are often very unrealistic. And depending what type of family and situation you come from, they can be sometimes really harsh as well too. So, one action step that you can help yourself process this around is you want to write down the thoughts or situations that trigger guilt. So, then write out whatever the situations are. This is also going to give you an idea of how frequent you're feeling guilty. And then you want to ask yourself, are these beliefs helpful or are they limiting? Okay. And when you ask yourself that question, that's where you're going to have to see, like, if they're limiting and I've been behaving from this space, like how much have I been holding myself back? The other part we want to do is we want to reframe the narrative. So we want to ideally replace guilt with more compassionate beliefs. And the reason we want to do that is because it's normal to make mistakes. It's normal to not maybe always have the best response that you think you could have. But it's a lot healthier to learn from them than again continuously shame yourself and end up in that cycle all the time, right? The next thing you want to do is we want to create healthy boundaries. And one thing I've really noticed is that guilt often surfaces when we're overextending ourselves and we're not respecting our own needs. And so, this is why learning to set boundaries is really important, because when we can set them and we can maintain them, we like it really reduces the amount of guilt that you'll typically start to feel. Now, how do we start to do this? Because again, a lot of my clients struggle with setting boundaries. Well, the way we do it is we start by setting boundaries in really like low stake situations. So situations that aren't going to have like a big effect on you, whether you say no or not. But we need to just build up the skill set of being able to set a boundary and not overcommitting yourself and not always neglecting your needs. So maybe that's something as saying no to like drinks after work or saying no to taking client meetings past 5 p.m. You know what I mean? Like just these little habits of setting these boundaries and reinforcing them. That's the skill set that we want to bring into place. Because again, when you get more in tune with like honoring your needs and listening to your internal self, there's less space for guilt to come in. Right. And again, it's creating a new relationship with it. And then the other part of that is we want to just make sure we're being really compassionate with ourselves while we're reprogramming this. Like every single human makes mistakes. I always say that the parts of us that bring us closer together as humans are the parts that we're most ashamed of. And so when we're making mistakes, when maybe we didn't say the best thing that we wanted to say, or maybe we weren't able to show up the way we hoped to, like the more you can just like take a moment and pause and say something like, like it's okay to make mistakes. I'm learning and I'm doing the best I can and I'm committed to getting better. That little simple act of self-acceptance can go such a long way, but the key is to be repetitive with that. Like it's not enough to just say it once. It has to be a constant practice of extending compassion to yourself. And that's like one of the things I talk with my clients about a lot, like when we're working on this self-compassion, self-love, self-acceptance piece. I'm like, it doesn't have to be overly gushy. It can just be something as simple as like, this is where I'm at, and that's okay, but I'm committed to continue moving forward towards my goals. I think the thing that challenges us most is that when we like when we say something is okay, or when we speak our truth, we think that it's almost like accepting defeat. Like if I am committed to working out every morning at 9 a.m. and tomorrow I get up, I'm like, fuck, I don't want to go. Like, I don't want to go. I'm tired. I could use the extra sleep. Like, I don't want to go. Most people would be like, think positive. Like, you got to go, just like, don't acknowledge that you have any resistance any resistance towards doing this early workout. Right. But it's my truth. I don't want to go. And what I've been teaching people is like, it's okay to say your truth and accept it. But then that doesn't mean you give up on whatever the goal is. So yeah, do I not want to go? No, I don't want to go. However, I'm still committed to being the best, most physically in shape version of myself this year. And so I am going to go. But I'm not going to ignore the fact that I didn't want to be here today. Right? Like that's just the healthiness of being a human. If you're constantly denying your truth and your reality, well, then you're constantly denying yourself to an extent. But acceptance of self doesn't mean you just give up. Acceptance of self just means acknowledging you and meeting you where you're at and then choosing to move forward anyways. Right? So again, when it comes to guilt, we have to look at the relationship we have with it. Because if it's an unhealthy relationship, just like anything else, that has a shelf life. And the way that shows up is going to be different. But again, the way I see it most commonly showed up is resentment, burnout, and disconnected from yourself. That's it. And again, just because you feel guilt more often doesn't mean you're any better of a human. Like that's not what that is. It just means that you are so familiar with being in situations where you have to choose someone else's needs over yours, to the point where you'll make up a lot of those stories. Like again, it's not even and sometimes it's projected, but a lot of the times it's you just making up a story in your head as to why your needs aren't good enough, or choosing yourself is not the right choice, and you inflict the guilt on yourself. Right? Like that's honestly probably it 9 times out of 10. 9 times out of 10 you inflict the guilt upon yourself because of the story you made up in your head. And the other party probably doesn't even know that story's happening. You know what I mean? But you make it that way and then you internally resent them, and then you hold it against them, and then they're saying, I didn't know you're thinking that. I didn't even know that was on your mind. Like, what what? Like, do you see how we inflict so much suffering on ourselves as humans? That is so unnecessary, and think about how much energy guilt eats up. Like, I know you can feel it right now. If you're listening to this, you can immediately go to a situation where you felt so much guilt and it was a pit in your stomach, or like a sunken feeling in your chest, knowing that like, oh, I'm just going to have to like pick something else that isn't actually what I want. Right? However, again, until you take that time to separate yourself and really process what guilt is, how it shows up in your life, what your relationship with it is. And I suggest doing this with a journal. Get your journal, Go answer all the questions I just gave to you, right? And really sit with that until you put that on paper and really have a good look at that relationship with guilt. It's going to keep dictating your life. And again, it's going to lead you into a place where you don't feel fulfilled. You question your purpose. You feel like you're living for everybody else. And that is going to reinforce the behavior of always needing external validation because you don't even know how to give it to yourself. So that's my rant on guilt today. I hope it can help you. I'm probably going to talk about this topic again in the future because it's something so many people deal with. But if you're going to take anything from this today, is just to take a step back, take an hour, and really, really become aware of your relationship with guilt. Because it's not until you know exactly what your relationship looks like now, can you know what you need to make it more healthy. And again, it's a feeling, it's an emotion of the moment. It does not dictate the reality of the situation. So don't let something that's fleeting in the moment help you make permanent decisions. Doesn't seem like really good advice, does it? It doesn't sound like a sound strategy, I should say. So that's it for today. If anyone wants to talk about this more, my DMs are always open. Shoot me a DM on Instagram. Send me a message on LinkedIn, and let's chop it up.